Linux can still make an old computer useful, but the advice has changed. On one side, Linux Mint says 4 GB of memory is recommended for comfortable use. On the other, Ubuntu Desktop currently lists 6 GB. That gap is not a verdict that one distro is good and the other is bad. It is a useful warning that the desktop experience you choose matters just as much as the age of the laptop sitting on your desk. If you have an older machine, you have probably heard the familiar recommendation: install Linux and it will feel brand new. Sometimes that is completely true. Other times, the install goes well, the desktop looks beautiful, and then a browser with a few tabs or a video call turns the experience into a slow-motion argument with your hardware. And this is where Wayland enters the conversation. Wayland is increasingly part of the modern Linux desktop, but it is not a magic performance switch, and it is not automatically the reason an old PC feels slow. The experience comes from the entire stack: your storage, memory, GPU driver, compositor, desktop environment, browser, and the applications you actually use. And this is where Wayland enters the conversation. Wayland is increasingly part of the modern Linux desktop, but it is not a magic performance switch, and it is not automatically the reason an old PC feels slow. Today, we are not going to declare a universal winner based on made-up benchmark numbers. Instead, we are going to answer the question that actually matters. On your old laptop, what combination is likely to work well? What should you avoid? And when does spending a little money on hardware make more sense than endlessly chasing the lightest distro? There are 3 questions we need to settle. First, is Wayland itself the problem, or are we blaming the wrong layer? Second, can an SSD upgrade make more difference than replacing your desktop environment? And third, with Linux Mint bringing its Wayland support closer to full maturity, is there finally a sensible middle ground for normal users? The answer will be more nuanced than Wayland bad or old hardware is dead. And that nuance matters because an old PC can still be a very capable machine when you match the software to the hardware, rather than forcing the hardware to imitate a modern workstation. So, before we compare desktops, we need to separate the part of the Linux stack that Wayland actually changes from the parts that are quietly doing most of the work. Because that distinction is where a lot of the confusion begins. Chapter 2 of 10. Wayland is not the whole desktop. Let's clear up the biggest misunderstanding first. When someone says, Wayland is too heavy for my old laptop, they are usually describing a real problem. But the root cause may not be Wayland in the narrow technical sense. Wayland is the protocol and architecture that helps applications talk to the display server. On a modern Linux desktop, the compositor is often responsible for both drawing the desktop and acting as the Wayland display server. That means the practical experience is tied to the compositor, the graphics driver, the desktop environment's choices, and the applications running on top of it. That distinction is important. 2 laptops can both be running a Wayland session and feel completely different. One may have an SSD, enough memory, a supported integrated GPU, and a lightweight set of applications. The other may be trying to run a heavy browser workload from a spinning hard drive with 4 GB of memory and an older graphics driver. Calling both experiences Wayland performance tells you very little. The same logic applies to X11. Switching to an X11 session can sometimes be the right troubleshooting step, especially if a particular driver or application behaves badly. But it does not automatically solve a shortage of memory or make a mechanical hard drive fast. If a laptop spends most of its time waiting for data from storage, changing display protocols is not going to make the browser magically responsive. There's also a reason this topic is worth revisiting now. Linux Mint says its next Cinnamon version will support both X11 and Wayland fully, and that Wayland will no longer be treated as experimental. The project describes work on things like hardware acceleration, high DPI support, multi-monitor behavior, and X-Wayland stability. That does not mean every old laptop will suddenly run a modern desktop effortlessly. It does mean the old shorthand, use X11 because Wayland is experimental, is becoming less useful as a universal rule. So instead of treating Wayland as a yes or no decision, think of it as one part of a compatibility equation. Is your graphics stack healthy? Is there enough memory for the workload? Is the storage still a hard drive? And does the desktop environment match the capabilities of the machine? That last question is where things become practical. Because once we stop blaming a single layer, we can build a much better way to choose a distro. And it starts with knowing what hardware actually puts the brakes on your experience. If you want to make an old laptop feel better, the first job is diagnosis. Not distro hopping, not switching protocols at random, diagnosis. The four usual suspects are memory, storage, graphics support, and CPU performance. They overlap, which is why an upgrade can feel miraculous on one machine and barely noticeable on another. Start with memory. 4 GB can still be workable for a modest workload, but today's browsers are not modest by default. A few modern tabs, a web-based mail client, a streaming service, and a video call can consume more memory than an older laptop has available. Once the system starts swapping aggressively to disk, the desktop feels slow, even if the CPU is barely working. On a machine with a mechanical hard drive, that slowdown can become painfully obvious. Then there is storage. This is the second open loop from the start of the video, and it deserves a direct answer. Yes, replacing a mechanical hard drive with an SSD can fundamentally change how an older laptop feels. It improves booting, application launches, package updates, everyday multitasking, and swapping behavior. It cannot compensate for a completely inadequate CPU or broken graphics support, but it often changes the entire equation enough that the distro you thought was too heavy becomes perfectly reasonable. Graphics support is the area most relevant to Wayland. A well-supported integrated Intel or AMD GPU can provide a very good Wayland experience, even on hardware that is not new. But old proprietary NVIDIA hardware, unusual hybrid graphics setups, or drivers that were never well supported can produce rough edges. That is when X11 may still be a practical fallback, not because it is universally faster, but because it may be better matched to a particular driver and application combination. Finally, the CPU. A dual-core processor can still be enough for writing, browsing in moderation, terminal work, email, and media playback. It becomes the limiting factor when you stack background services, heavy web applications, video calls, high-resolution streams, and browser extensions. Add poor cooling or a weak battery profile, and you have a machine that feels inconsistent rather than simply slow. The point is not to turn every viewer into a support engineer. The point is to give you a quick mental model. If the machine has a hard drive, storage is often the first thing to question. If it has very little memory, reduce the workload or add RAM where possible. If it has a difficult GPU, choose the best supported session. And if the CPU is simply too old for the work you expect, the honest answer may be to use a lighter workflow, not to promise that any distro will turn it into a 2026 Ultrabook. Now that we know what can go wrong, we can put the most common all-PC hardware profiles into a practical set of categories. The fastest way to give bad Linux advice is to treat every old laptop as the same laptop. So let's divide the problem into 4 practical profiles. Profile 1 is the relatively healthy older machine. Think an SSD, at least 8 GB of memory and integrated graphics that are still supported properly. This is often a laptop from the middle of the last decade that was reasonably capable when it was new and has not been held back by a mechanical drive. On this kind of system, a current GNOME, KDE Plasma or Cinnamon Wayland session can be completely realistic. The key is not the calendar year on the sticker. It is the condition of the storage, the amount of memory and the driver support. Profile 2 is the balanced budget rescue. This might have 4 to 8 GB of memory and an SSD, or a hard drive that you are willing to replace. The CPU is older but usable. This is where Linux Mint with a lighter desktop, a carefully chosen Fedora spin, or another lightweight environment starts to make a lot of sense. You are not trying to make the machine look like a high-end workstation. You are building a stable desktop. You need it for browsing, documents, media, email, and light development. Profile 3 is constrained hardware. 4 GB or less, a mechanical hard drive, and an older dual-core processor are common here. You can absolutely make this machine useful, but the expectations have to be realistic. A lightweight desktop environment and a restrained browser workflow are more important than keeping up with every modern visual effect. Linux Mint's published requirement of 4 GB for comfortable use gives you a useful baseline, but the workload is still decisive. Profile 4 is the legacy or difficult graphics case. Think very old NVIDIA hardware, awkward hybrid graphics, a 32-bit only system, or a machine with severe thermal issues. This is where the sensible answer may include a more specialized lightweight distribution, an X11 session, a server or home lab role, or simply retiring the hardware. There is no shame in that. The goal is a dependable result, not ideological purity. The better question is, what do I need this hardware to do, and what constraints should guide the desktop choice? There is one desktop path that tends to trigger more debate than any other: a modern GNOME-style setup on an older laptop. It can be smooth and productive, but it can also be the wrong place to start if the system already struggles. Let's look at that profile honestly. Let's take the more demanding route first: a modern desktop such as Ubuntu with GNOME or a current KDE Plasma setup using Wayland. These are not automatically bad choices for old hardware. In fact, on the right machine, they can be excellent. You get current accessibility work, polished touchpad behavior, high DPI improvements, modern application support, and an experience that feels coherent rather than compromised. But it is important to respect what the distribution is telling you. Ubuntu Desktop currently lists 6 GB of system memory in its published requirements. That is not a promise that anything below that will fail to boot. It is a clue about the experience Ubuntu is designed to provide. If your old laptop has 8 GB of memory, an SSD, healthy cooling, and supported integrated graphics, trying a current Wayland session is reasonable. You do not need to exile it to a lightweight desktop just because it was released years ago. The problem comes when we confuse "it runs" with "it is the best fit." A system that boots into GNOME but begins swapping after 2 browser windows and a video call is not necessarily broken. It may simply be mismatched to the workload. And if that is your machine, you will get a larger improvement by changing the workload, storage, or desktop environment than by arguing about which display protocol deserves the blame. This is also where the first open loop gets its answer. Does Wayland inherently use more memory than X11? There is no honest universal number. Different compositors, desktops, drivers, versions, and applications behave differently. The practical takeaway is simpler. Judge the complete desktop session on your actual hardware and use a repeatable set of tasks. Boot it, browse, play the media you normally play, connect the display you normally use, and see whether it remains responsive. Do not draw conclusions from a single idle memory screenshot. By the way, I checked our channel analytics before putting this together, and about 85% of you watching right now are not subscribed. If these practical Linux deep dives help you make better decisions with the hardware you already own, subscribing is the best free way to support the channel. And make sure you do not miss the next one. And if your machine does not meet that modern desktop profile, that is not the end of the road. It is where a lighter, more focused Linux setup becomes the smarter choice. Not as a consolation prize, but as a way of getting the best experience from the hardware you already have. Now let's talk about the option many people dismiss too quickly: a lightweight desktop environment. There is a tendency in Linux discussions to treat a lightweight desktop as something you install only after modern Linux has failed. That is the wrong way to think about it. A lighter desktop is often the intentional choice for someone who values responsiveness, lower background overhead, a familiar workflow, and a machine that stays out of the way. Linux Mint's own FAQ gives us a useful starting point: 2 GB of memory as a minimum, with 4 GB recommended for comfortable usage. Again, that does not tell us everything. A laptop with 4 GB of memory and a hard drive can still struggle if you ask it to run a dozen Chrome tabs. But it does tell us that the desktop design target is different from a more demanding Ubuntu GNOME installation. For a user with a capable but aging laptop, Linux Mint XFCE is an easy recommendation because it provides an approachable distribution with a desktop that is familiar and restrained. It is not the only choice. LXQT, Mate, and other lighter environments can work well too. But the key is that they reduce the amount of visual and compositing work the system is asked to do, leaving more headroom for the things you actually care about. This is where the SSD question becomes much easier to answer. If you have a laptop with 4 or 8 GB of memory and a slow mechanical hard drive, An SSD upgrade often gives you the biggest day-to-day improvement. It does not merely make one desktop faster. It makes package management, application launches, browser cache access, suspend and resume, and occasional swapping less painful. In many cases, that means you can choose the desktop based on usability rather than purely on survival. Here is the decision rule I would use. If the laptop has an SSD and at least 4 GB of memory, try a lighter desktop first and see whether it meets your real workload. If it still feels constrained, simplify the browser and background applications. If it has a mechanical hard drive and supports an SSD upgrade, consider doing that before abandoning the machine. And if it has limited memory that cannot be upgraded, select the most modest desktop and workflow you can live with, rather than forcing a shiny, modern environment to run badly. The interesting part is that we are no longer choosing between old school and modern. The next version of Linux Mint is working toward a more mature Wayland experience while maintaining a practical approach to hardware. That gives us a possible middle ground, but we need to be precise about what it promises and what it does not. If you want the most interesting answer to the original question, it may be this. Linux Mint is making the old Wayland versus lightweight desktop discussion less binary. The project says that Wayland support in the next version of Cinnamon will no longer be considered experimental. It also describes work on improved window mapping, focus handling, crash fixes, multi-monitor and KVM switch support, hardware acceleration, HIDPI, and X-Wayland stability. Those are not headline features in the same way that a new icon theme might be, but they are exactly the kind of under-the-hood improvements that determine whether a desktop feels dependable on real hardware. For an old PC user, that creates a useful path. You may be able to keep the practical, familiar Cinnamon environment while evaluating Wayland when it is appropriate for your graphics stack and workflow. And if a particular application, screen sharing flow, or older driver behaves badly, you still have a realistic fallback route rather than having to change distributions entirely. But this is not an invitation to treat a planned release as a finished product today. The responsible approach is to wait for the stable release, read its release notes, test it from live media or on a spare installation, and keep a known good session available. The fact that a feature is maturing does not remove the need to test the specific machine you own. The goal is to move beyond protocol tribalism. You do not need to choose a side permanently. You choose the configuration that works for your setup. There is another benefit to the middle ground approach. It helps us move away from protocol tribalism. You do not need to choose a side permanently. The goal is to choose the session and configuration that works for your display setup, applications, and hardware. A well-functioning X11 session is still better than a Wayland session that breaks your workflow. A smooth Wayland session can be better than an X11 setup if it improves the things you use every day. The operating system is supposed to serve the user, not win an argument online. That leaves one difficult category: the machines where the issue is not simply memory or storage, but aging or awkward graphics hardware. Before we pick a final distro, we need to look at the cases where the conventional advice needs the most caution. The difficult cases are not always the weakest CPUs. Sometimes a surprisingly capable old laptop feels rough because the graphics path is awkward. If you have older Intel or AMD integrated graphics with good current kernel and Mesa support, a modern Wayland session may work very well. That is why it is dangerous to judge a laptop by age alone. But if you have an older proprietary GPU, unusual hybrid graphics, a legacy driver requirement, or a laptop whose external display path was already fiddly under X11, you need to treat Wayland as a compatibility evaluation rather than an automatic upgrade. The first rule is simple: do not test your entire opinion of a distro from a login screen. The problems that matter often show up after you connect an external display, share your screen, wake from suspend, play protected media, use a remote desktop session, or run the one application you need for work. A desktop can look perfectly smooth for 5 minutes and still be a poor fit for your actual day. This is why I recommend a small, repeatable compatibility routine. First, boot the distribution from live media if that workflow is supported. Second, Check the internal screen, Wi-Fi, audio, Bluetooth, webcam and touchpad. Third, connect the display or dock you normally use. Fourth, test, suspend and resume. Finally, open the exact browser, Office suite, remote session or creative application that determines whether this laptop remains useful for you. If a Wayland session passes that real-world test, excellent, keep it. If something important fails, do not assume you did anything wrong. Use the better supported session for that machine and revisit the question after a future update. Linux desktop support evolves constantly, but your ability to work today matters more than chasing a checkbox labeled modern. This is also where the final open loop gets its answer. Is Linux Mint's emerging Wayland support the right middle ground? Potentially yes, especially for users who want Cinnamon's familiar workflow and a cautious migration path. But the word potentially matters. The distro cannot know your exact GPU, dock, monitor and application mix. Only your own short compatibility test can answer that. So we have the hardware model, the modern desktop path, the lightweight desktop path and the cautious Wayland path. Now we can make this useful by turning it into a simple decision process you can apply before you download anything. Now we can give a straight answer to the title question. Which distro fits an old PC running or considering Wayland? If your laptop has an SSD, 8 GB of memory or more, and graphics that are well supported, start with the desktop you actually want to use. Ubuntu with GNOME, Fedora Workstation, KDE Plasma, or Cinnamon can all be reasonable candidates. In this category, choosing a modern Wayland session is not an act of optimism. It is a sensible default, provided your real workflow checks pass. If the laptop has 4 to 8 GB of memory and either an SSD or a clear upgrade path to one, I would look first at Linux Mint with a lighter desktop, a well-maintained XFCE-based option, or a carefully selected Plasma setup if you prefer its workflow. The goal is balanced usability. You still get a current Linux distribution, but you avoid spending a large portion of your available resources on visual complexity you may not need. If the machine has 4 GB of memory or less, a mechanical hard drive and an older dual-core processor, choose the lightest comfortable workflow. Linux Mint XFCE, LXQT, Mate or another modest environment may fit far better than trying to force a full modern desktop. And if the storage can be upgraded, the SSD should be near the top of your list. This is the clearest answer to the second open loop. Yes, an SSD can change the right distro choice by removing a major source of perceived slowness. If the system has legacy or awkward graphics, start from compatibility rather than aesthetics. Pick the distribution that gives you the easiest way to test both sessions, keep a backup plan, and use the setup that handles your display, suspend, external monitor, and key applications reliably. This may mean Wayland, it may mean X11 for now. A working laptop is the winner. And finally, if the machine cannot run a supported 64-bit desktop distribution comfortably, do not force it into a role it cannot perform. It might still become a small server, a network appliance, a retro gaming system, a lightweight writing device, or a machine for a family member with a very simple workload. Extending the useful life of hardware does not always mean using it in the same way you used it 10 years ago. The best distro is not the one with the most exciting release notes. It is the one that gives you a stable, responsive machine for the work you actually do. That is a less dramatic conclusion, but it is much more useful and it leads directly to the small testing plan that will keep you from making a regrettable install decision. So which distro wins on old PCs? The honest answer is that the right match wins. A modern Wayland desktop can be an excellent option for an older laptop with an SSD, enough memory and a healthy graphics stack. You do not have to punish a capable machine just because it is not new. If it runs your normal work smoothly, handles your displays, wakes reliably, and supports the applications you need, then it has earned its place as a modern Linux desktop. A lightweight desktop is the better choice when the hardware has less headroom, when the workload is simple, or when you would rather spend the resources on your browser and applications than on desktop effects. That is not settling for less. It is making an informed choice that respects the machine. And if the laptop has a mechanical hard drive, very limited memory, or awkward legacy graphics, the best investment may be an SSD, a lighter workflow, an X11 fallback, or a new role for the hardware entirely. The point is not to win a distro debate. The point is to end up with a computer that you enjoy using. There's one more principle worth keeping. Do not make a decision based on a single screenshot of memory use, a single comment thread, or somebody else's hardware. Test the distribution from live media if you can. Try your normal browser tabs. Connect the monitor or dock you actually use. Suspend the machine. Use the applications that earn the laptop a place on your desk. Then choose what feels dependable. Wayland is no longer a future-only topic. It is part of the modern Linux desktop now, and projects like Linux Mint are making it easier to evaluate without giving up practical options. But the protocol is only one layer. Storage, memory, graphic support, and workload are still the things that decide whether an old PC feels rescued or simply frustrated. If this helps you make a more confident choice for an old laptop, like the video and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel directly and get some cool perks, consider clicking the join button below to become a pseudo user or get root access. You can also sign up at tondoslinux.com/subscribe for more Tondos Linux updates. Before you install anything, tell me in the comments, what is the oldest laptop you still use and what desktop environment keeps it alive?